All right, I'm going to start out by sharing my desktop. You should all be able to see this without any problems. And what I'm going to do is just set up a couple of screens here for my little preview. All right. All right, thank you everybody for attending today. Again, if you would please keep your phones on mute or your computers communications on mute, I appreciate that. So let's get started. Our presentation today is going to be talking about our specialty inks and file preparation with the RIP controls and profile settings. So all things related to specialty inks. So one thing that I want to start out with describing is what the specialty inks are, what we refer to as specialty inks. Now this is saying this paper I'm displaying to you, and I will email this out, is designing with white and specialty ink. And when I scroll down a little bit, this is going to have a beginning monologue talking about the information of what do we consider as our specialty inks. And this gives some pretty good definitions throughout the beginning part of this. So one thing we talk about is our typical process inks, CMYK. We're converting this information. Spot inks. Spot inks could actually be something more like a white ink, metallic silver ink. A lot of times you'll see that on printers as an MS or metallic silver. Some printers are working with fluorescent inks or some gloss enhancers or varnishes, so primer or varnish. So when we talk about specialty ink, what I want you to think about is white, silver, and varnish. And again, varnish might be described as varnish or primer, but for the most part, we're referring to this as our white, our silver, and our varnish. And those are our specialty inks. Within our inks, with our various printers, we may have extended gamut inks. Okay, now this is a little bit different. These are our red inks, orange, green, blue inks. Okay, different inks that give extra colorfulness to our gamut. We create a media profile. So those inks are a different category than the specialty inks. So I just kind of want to point that out to you according to what we have here in our descriptions and our documentation. So specialty ink, white, silver, or varnish. And this white paper that I'm displaying to you is going to talk about the design considerations, whether they're in Photoshop and what we need to do to identify the channel or separation that's going to represent the white, silver, or varnish, and how we would go about creating that and then saving that out to include that spot color channel or alpha channel. That's using Photoshop. A little further down, the document talks about preparing the file in Illustrator. And in Illustrator, we would create or start this out as a spot color. And then we would give it a designation of a name and some type of display color. So when we talk about preparing the files for our specialty inks, white, silver, or varnish, we have to prepare the file upstream in Photoshop or in Illustrator a specific way. Now, this is not to say if a customer gives us a file, if we get a file to print that does not contain the specialty ink channel or spot color, we can still work with it in ONYX, and we're going to go over this. We've got a feature called Spot Layer Tool. So if a file is not prepared upstream in desktop for the specialty ink, we are able to use Spot Layer Tool in Job Editor and create some information to represent that specialty ink, that spot, that kind of color for white, silver, or varnish. So when we take a look at creating this information, we have the steps here talking about this in Photoshop and in Illustrator. When we create this, a few guidelines come into play. When we generate the object with the fill of the color for our specialty ink, so it's white, it's silver, it's varnish, or if we go with our default naming convention, spot 1, spot 2, when we have our object generated or created in Illustrator, that object must be on the very top object layer on top of the other objects, and it must be overprinting. So here you see the attributes window on the right in Illustrator, and we need to select overprint fill. So these two rules are very important, that the spot color object that represents white, silver, or varnish specialty ink must be, the object must be on top, and it must be overprinting. And then we would save our file and send that over to the RIP. Now, just because we're having our spot color, specialty color, white, silver, or varnish on top and overprinting does not impact print order. So later on, we're going to take a look at Media Manager and a few of the steps that it takes to get started with creating a media profile for our specialty inks. It is there in Media Manager where we are going to control printing order, meaning I'm printing on a clear media. I want my white ink to go down first, and then my CMYK ink on top. Or I want my CMYK ink to go down first, and then my white ink to go on top. The printing order of the colors will take place in the media profile. What we are talking about here in this step is simply that the object that we're going to create, the shape that we're going to create that represents the specialty ink, white, silver, or varnish, object must be on top and overprinting. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this in a moment. Let's go into, I've got this file. This is one of our training files that we use. This is the file representing with the white ink in here. So if I show you, if I disable my color image, you can see this information is actually going to contain this is my information for my specialty ink. So if I double click my swatch, this is a spot color named Spot 1. So in ONYX, our default naming convention for specialty inks when we create our media profile defaults to Spot 1, Spot 2, and so forth. Exactly how the spelling is, uppercase S, lowercase POT, and the number 1, no space bar. So yes, this is case and space sensitive and how this is named. So if I conform to the media profile name for the specialty ink as Spot 1, Spot 2 to represent my white or my silver or my varnish, I could keep the name here in Illustrator as that name. Or in some cases, clients might say, well, I'm going to name this white. And they're going to rename this information here, and they're going to say white, or they might say white 1, because white's actually kind of used in your palette, if you will. So you might say white 1 or white color or white spot or something to that effect. If we decide to rename this from Spot 1, which is ONYX default naming convention for the specialty inks, what we would do then, I'll show you this, is in our Quickstart, we will make an alias to represent this. In other words, I will alias Spot 1 and white 1. Whenever I see white 1, understand that this is Spot 1 and use that specialty ink in my profile. So I'll go through those steps with you as well. But just to point out to you, this file is prepared with a Spot 1 color that's in here, named the same naming convention as we're going to see in our media profile. The color representation is nothing more than just a color representation, right? Just a preview here. And this is to the file in Illustrator. Okay, so in the end, this would be our object that we would be getting with the information that's here. Okay, so now let me go into my RIP queue. And in my RIP, if I start out and I say I want to go through and create a new media profile. I'm going to launch Media Manager at the top, and then in Media Manager, and I'm going to use the Epson Sure Color as an example. This has a white ink channel, and it's in the printer configuration, so I'm going to use this as an example to talk to. So I would start out in my Media Manager, and I would start out with a new group or use an existing group, and I'm going to create a new media profile. The workflow I'm creating this as is going to be an ONYX workflow. In other words, ONYX software will control all of the steps of building this profile. And then I'm going to start out with a name. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to just categorize this as white ink with clear media, something to that effect. Again, your name of your media is much more verbose for what you do in your industries and your media type. I'm just giving this as an example, so it's very clear in training and just showing you what this is about. Next, I'm going to select the ONYX ink configuration. Now you'll see here, depending on the printer manufacturer that you're working with, is going to depend on the options here. This is a printer that has an orange and a red ink, and W for white, MS for metallic silver. Some printer manufacturers will refer to the specialty inks instead of W for white, MS for metallic silver. Some will refer to this as S for spot. So you might see S for spot. So just to point out, depending on the printer manufacturer you're working with, they have different naming conventions for their ink configuration we're going to use. So I'll start out by saying I'm going to work with my white, so CMYK, light inks, orange, red, and white. Number 2, select the process colors used to render my images. This is different than, you'll notice it's not going to include those specialty inks. This is what the image content is going to be made up of. And again, file preparation could be a part of this if you wanted your image record to be that one of those specialty inks, but just to say in a typical image configuration, how do you want your image to be rendered for color? So I'm going to pick even my extended gamut colors in here as well. Number 3, my media profile. This is where I would select from a preset what type of material is it that I'm working with. Okay, rough general categories are here. Again, depending on the printer manufacturer you're working with, the printer driver you're working with is going to depend on all of these options. Now we get to this part of spots, configuring the spot color. So because I selected up at the top a W for white, or an MS for metallic silver, or a V for varnish, or a P for primer, if you see that. But because I picked a specialty ink up here, my number 1 ink configuration to use, I now have one spot color defined. That's my clue right there. As soon as I pick something that has a W, MS, or V for varnish, or a spot indicator, I will have a spot added to my library here. Now I'm going to click on the spot color setup button, and we're going to talk about what's going on here. Automatically, ONYX will generate, by our default name, Spot 1, as you can see, capital S, all one word. ONYX will generate a spot channel for this, a spot ink setup for this, okay, Spot 1. If I select that and edit, this is where I can change the name and say it's called white, or white 1, or white ink, or silver, or MS, or varnish. This name could be the name that they design the file spot color in Illustrator. This could be that same matching name. So if it is a different name that my designers are calling it and they're not naming it as Spot 1, as I have indicated here, our default, if they're naming it something differently, we can change the name here and that information would select the data from the file. So if I did say white ink and in Illustrator, I named that spot color white ink, it's going to pick up that information. However, if I leave this as is and I don't change it, I will show you back in the Quickstart where I can alias and say white ink or silver or varnish and et cetera, how I'd give it that other name and alias it to represent spot 1. Okay, directly below is our display color. So even though we set up a beige type of a color in Illustrator to represent what that white tiger was going to look like, the color, right? We represent that as that beige kind of goldy sort of color. That's my white ink right there. Even though I do that, here, when I open my job in Job Editor, when I see my thumbnail preview in my RipQ, what should that display color represent? So this is where you can click on Choose Color. And there's a couple of different theories behind this. Some people like to grab a very bold color like this bright green. Some people want to grab a bold magenta or a cyan or something that really stands out. It is completely up to you, right? Of course, completely up to you and how you want that display color to look. But if we do something bold that stands out, we'll recognize that immediately to say, oh, that bright green is going to represent my white ink or my specialty ink. Below is the opacity setting. Now, I think ours usually defaults at 75%, and again, it could depend on the printer manufacturer. So typically I see these at 75%. This is going to be, again, display options. When I preview my file in Job Editor, how is that white ink in the design file going to appear with the rest of the image colors? So by having an opacity set to 75, I'm going to have this bright green representing my white ink display color translucent or opaque 75%. So I'll see my other image and content come through, the actual white tiger image come through. Now you can lower this if you like, that's fine, it's just your option. So this is just a preset condition here, a value. But for example, if I had this set to 100% opacity, you could imagine all I'm going to see is this bright green color. I won't see the image of the white tiger itself because I'm not putting on any opacity. I'm just totally saying 100% of that specialty ink display, which will be a bold green. And I won't see my image through that in Job Editor. Okay, so typically you'd want some type of a value less than 100 to see through the content. And we're definitely going to open up a file and you're going to see this effect take place. Okay, so that's my information, one spot color, W, and one spot color. Now I'm going to go next. I would put in the information that I want to create for this profile. And again, every printer manufacturer has different resolution options, different dot shape choices. I'm going to go to my mode. In this case, using that particular setup is giving me an 18 pass. And here is where we control the specialty ink print method, the print order. Okay, so a moment ago I said in the design of the file, the white object, the specialty ink object, in this case we're talking white, but the specialty ink object must be on top and overprinting. This right here where we are is where we control how that ink set is going to be configured. And so here is where I can say I want my spot color to print first, or I want my color to print first. So how do I want to control this order? Okay, do I want to print them simultaneously as a blend? But that's a different setting. Again, case by case per printer manufacturer. So if I said, well, I've got this clear material, I want my spot color, in this case white, to print down first, and then afterwards follow up and print with the color right on top of it behind it. And depending on how the printers are configured, depending on how the printer manufacturer kind of configures the heads, I suppose, you could get a few passes of white, 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 and then color comes in behind it. And you're kind of printing in tandem, if you will. Again, various printer manufacturers, various heads, different configurations, and so on. But just to throw that out a little bit to talk to it, this is going to really control that print order. Or do I want to put the color down first? Maybe it's mirrored, and then I put the white behind it. So this is just going to control that print order. This is where we control this. So I'm going to click OK, and to the back end of this, I might add other attributes about my mode. So resolution, quality, number of passes, bidirectional, unidirectional, dot shape. And I've indicated in my mode options, I've made my selection for my print order. Okay, so typically what I find working with different printer manufacturers, typically what I find is that the print order for the control, will white go down first or color go down first? That print order is typically controlled here in the mode options, but if I go back one level, it may be in the media options. Not particularly with this driver, but in some other printer manufacturers I've dealt with, it might be in the media options. So either media options or mode options is where you can see the print order. But the print order is definitely going to be controlled within the driver at the media profile level, okay? All right, now, next step. When we get to this part, and I'm not going to go through all the profiling steps, but I do want to touch on this very beginning part, which is important. Up to this point, we've been setting up the information that we want to configure for working with this specialty ink, and my example is white ink. The first thing we need to do before we print our normal ink restriction and measure and do our calibration and measure and so on, we need to print this specialty ink restriction chart test chart in order to determine how much of that specialty ink is enough, like a flood fill, how much ink volume is enough. So if I click on Print Specialty Ink Restriction Chart, I can pick my spot color, and I've only got one in here. And at this point, I could scale this up. Right now it's going to print, here's your size below, but you can enlarge this a bit if you like. Depending on your media size you have on your printer may dictate how large you go with this, okay? So I can scale this up. Let me take a peek back. In my rib queue, I've got a 36-inch roll, so I'll make that match, 36-inch roll. So maybe I'll go 1.5, which is like 150%. 1.0 is 100%. So maybe I'll scale that up 150%. Again, be aware of your size and your roll size, what might work. And now I'm going to print this specialty ink restriction chart print. I'm going to return to my rib queue. And in my rib queue, I see my file. And if I double click my file, I'll see job properties. And I get a little bit of a bigger preview here for you to see. So the idea behind this specialty ink restriction chart is on the left, it's going to print just the specialty ink by itself. Now I'm saying I'm working on a clear material, so I will see white ink at 100, 90, 80, 70, 60, all the way down to 0. White ink graduating out in different volumes of ink amount from 100 to 0 on the clear material itself. Clear backing, right? Nothing, just clear material. To the right, you'll see cyan, magenta, yellow, black, red, green, blue. To the right, we're going to have 100% cyan, 90, 80, 70, 60, 50. And it's going to repeat that for magenta, yellow, black, red, green, blue. It's basically 100 cyan to 50, magenta 100 to 50, and so on. And what we're seeing represented here is the solid white spot ink by itself, and then to the right, under solid cyan, 90 cyan, 80, 70, 60, 50, and then magenta, then yellow, then black, then red, green, blue. So let me go ahead and open this up in Job Editor. You might get a better preview there. So in Job Editor, you can see The point of this specialty ink restriction chart is to determine the volume amount of that specialty ink, white ink in my example. If I print successfully at 100%, and I like what I'm seeing here, I can set and pick my value in my profile back in Media Manager 100%, or I can say 90 or 80. So when we evaluate this, we're going to be looking to this left column here where spot is by itself, and we're going to determine how much white ink on this clear material is what I'm working with, pretending to work with here, how much of that white ink is opaque enough. If 100 and 90 and 80 all look the same, and then 70 starts to get a little bit different or lighter, maybe I say, hey, I'll go to 80 or I'll go to 90. I don't have to be at 100 if they are looking the same amount. And depending on the printer and the media, you're going to have different results here. It might just be that 100 is the heaviest step and that looks well as far as light blocking ability, because you can hold this up to the light. It's a clear material. See this white spot column by itself and determine how you want that to be. Or maybe 100, 90, 80, 70 all look the same. So now you say, hey, I'm going to go with an 80. Maybe not 70. I'll go up one more level, and I'll pick 80 amount of white ink to go. The second part is after you evaluate the spot white by itself on clear, you're going to look at it under color. Now, you might have said, hey, 80 white looked great by itself. But when you look at it under color and you compare 80% strength white ink, spot ink, under your cyan, magenta, yellow, black, red, green, blue, hundreds, 80, and you look at the 90 and the 100. Now there's another section for debate. Maybe you feel like, well, 80% white under these colors, I'm seeing enough of a difference from solid cyan at 80, solid cyan at the 90, or solid cyan at the 100. Now you're seeing a difference here, and you go, you know, I want 100. This looks the best under these colors for opacity and white and how the ink looks on top of that white ink. So that's two parts to this judgment of this test target. White ink or specialty ink by itself. In my example, I'm saying I'm using white ink on clear, and then also under color. So once we determine our volume amount, how much do we want for ink strength, 100, 90, 80, and so on, I'm going to submit this back to the RIP. And again, I would print this, so let me change my material to match. I would normally print this chart and then evaluate it, right? I'd go through and print it, see what it looks like, and evaluate it. Once I evaluate that and I go back into Media Manager, my next step is going to be pretty much my normal step going forward. Ink restriction, print, read, next. Calibration, print, read, next, and so forth. I now click on print, and you'll notice here I have some controls. So I can set my information. How do I want to handle that spot ink, that white or specialty ink, in this case white I'm talking about, but how do I want to handle it? Do I want that color to be a measured color? Do I want it to be a flood fill? And if I do tell it flood fill, this is where I can say what's the amount, 80 or 90 or 100. This is where I lock in that value from just evaluating it a moment ago. Okay, so depending on what you are determining when you evaluate your data is going to depend on what you're going to be choosing here. When I did my evaluation, maybe I said 90 looked good, or maybe it was 80, okay? When you type in this amount, and I'm just going to put 80 in there for a different number than 100, when I put in that amount, this menu right here will be locking in that amount. This menu will be setting the amount of Spot 1 Specialty Ink White. So in this case, I'm telling it we're going to control this as a flood fill amount. Now just above here, you can kind of see in the menu the definitions. Select Measure to print and measure a spot color. Select Flood Fill and enter a percentage amount to use the spot color for flood fill. or it's kind of a little truncated here, but deselect both and the program will select default color curves for the spot color. So if I deselect both, my software in ONYX is going to determine a default color curve for what this spot's going to look like. So my intent is I'm going to print with white ink. I want a certain amount, 80% strength of white ink, because that looked good in my ink chart. I just did my specialty ink chart, let's say. And my intent is that I'm going to print that as a flood fill underneath my next series of charts. And then I'm going to measure this with my spectrophotometer. This white ink flood fill is taking the place of the media base white, okay? So this is taking the place of that. So when we think about setting this up, I want to measure my data and I want that white information to go down first to be the base and then my chart on top. If I was working with a specialty ink of silver, in that case, I still might want to determine the amount of silver value. I still might test my specialty ink chart to determine how much silver is enough. But in the design of the file, I will be creating the shapes for silver. And in that case, I'm not necessarily saying flood fill for silver. I don't want to do a flood fill of silver behind my ink restriction chart and measure that. It's going to conflict with the CMYK, light cyan, light magenta, light black, orange, red inks that I'm printing this chart with. That silver as a backing is going to kind of distract my spectrophotometer from measuring the true steps on my ink restriction or my calibration or consequently my ICC profile. So in that case, and I wouldn't be measuring it because the silver, metallic silver reflectance would have an impact too, right, with the spectrophotometer. In that case, maybe I set this to both checkboxes off, or I do have that set for a value amount. So in this case, I'm going to set this up with my white as flood fill for sure, put in the amount I want. If I was working with something like a silver, I might not want to indicate, you know, what I want, that I want to do a flood fill for that amount that's in there. And then when it comes to a primer, it's the same situation. You may be printing with a varnish or a primer, and you want that to take place to print on your charts, and you want to measure through that information to capture the color attributes with your spectrophotometer through the primer. It's possible if you want to do that because if the primer or varnish has an impact on color, you might want to take that into consideration. So there's a couple of different kind of things, many different things we have to kind of consider here along the way. Now, if I was printing on a color material, let's say maybe I had like on a flatbed, I'm working with a black board material, and then I'm going to put white on top of that. I'm still going to say flood fill for that white area, and then my color chart will print on top of that, and I can measure that reflectively. There may be times where you're going to work on a film, a clear film, and you want to read through the material. In that case, you want to make sure that you're using a spectrophotometer that can measure transmissively and measure through the work, okay, through your art, your file itself, and measure through, not reflective. So there's another consideration to give for your spectrophotometer type based on the type of profiling you're doing for your media. All right, so for this example, I'm going to leave it at flood fill at 80% and say that that was my maximum good result in my specialty ink restriction chart. Now I'm going to go through just to show you the example. I print this chart back in my RibQ. I'll see this chart. Your ink restriction chart gives you cyan, magenta, yellow, black, orange ink, red ink, and your light inks, light cyan, light magenta, light black. And this would have a flood fill of my white. So I would print that information, come back into Media Manager. I would measure that data and evaluate my information. Now, at this point, because I don't have my information literally to read, I want to stop out of here and I want to go into one that's been created, and I'm going to edit this. And I want to show you that particular step. We have information in here for the ink restriction data. I can see my color data that was measured. Okay, when it comes to this white, so this would be us measuring that data. When it comes to the white or spot, specialty ink spot color that we're working with, white, silver, varnish, it might benefit you here to go to Show Advanced Settings and use Linear Process. So right now, this white has a bit of a curve to it, but if I click on this Use Linear Process, you will see I get a straight ramp at my value, whatever I have my value set to. So the idea behind this is 90% ink volume. It's going to give me a straight ramp. When we work with our specialty inks, white ink, silver ink, varnish ink, we don't necessarily need a curve applied to them. In our other separations, our other ink sets, yes, we can capture that data along a curve. But when we're talking about these specialty inks, this is just going to be a straight ramp, a straight 0 to 90%, 0 to 80%, 0 to 100%. We're just going to put a straight ramp to this. So this is another tip you guys can go into after you measure your ink restriction. You can go into your display your readings, and you can say Show Advanced Settings and then turn on Use Linear Process Values, and you'll notice that ramp. It's only going to take place on the tab of the color we're looking at, so only for white. My red, my orange, my black, and so forth, all these other colors still have their ramps, but my white has got that enabled now. So that's another consideration where you might want to go through and set that up as a linear data. We don't necessarily need a curve for those specialty inks. Okay, now every next step of the way, we go into calibration and we print our calibration, we're going to keep telling it to do a flood fill. Remember, we're setting up an example for white ink as a flood fill. And our example would be like 80%, as I was talking about earlier. Notice in this linearization part, it's got the option for calibration or no calibration. No calibration, you could turn it on or turn it off. So as you read these definitions here, you're going to select measure the both print and measure the spot color. We're not measuring white, we're doing a flood fill. We're going to do flood fill to get that specialty ink spot color as a flood, white flood. And no calibration to get a linear process value of the specialty ink, of white ink. So in that case, I might say no calibration to that data. Let that be a linear process at the 80 or the 90 or the 100. So just to say that's another area to consider. Okay, and then next, we go to print our ink limits. Again, at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see every step of the way with our charts, you're going to see how do we want to handle that specialty ink that we're working with. How do we want to handle that? Flood fill, we're going to turn on white, check it on for flood fill, and print that chart. Then next, our ICCs. When I go to print my ICCs, I get the same option again here. It's going to state, how do I want to handle that spot color, flood fill? I want a flood fill for white. So normally it'd be off, I would turn that on and say flood fill. Okay, so let me go out of here and back into the one that I was working with, and I'll edit that to just kind of get back into that setting. Okay, so again, if I print my calibration, I can say I'm going to do a flood fill, no calibration to get that linear ramp. When I do my ink limiting, again, spot 1, flood fill, continue. I'm just hitting cancel, so I'm not going to print. And then my ICC, again, just to show you, spot 1. So depending on how we name that color, in our second step there of our media setup, how are we naming that specialty ink? I named it spot 1. I left it at spot 1 just to show you. Okay, so every step of the way, we're going to be telling it for flood fill for that white ink. Okay, now, let's say I've got that completed and my profile is made. So I've got my selection made with my new choice. I know it's not completed, but it's got some data there to work with. I created this media profile with the specialty ink name designated as Spot 1, our default. So when it's got that Spot 1, just that generic name to it, my file might have a specialty ink called white ink, something different. How do I alias that? So we would go into our Quickset. I'm going to edit my default Quickset, and in my Change Profiles menu for color management, I'm going to go to the third tab, Output, and at the very bottom, Spot Channel Replacement. This is where I would be setting up my alias. My profile is recognizing or telling Spot 1 to use a white ink, but in the design of the file, I might have made that spot color for that white ink, and I might have named it white ink itself, or white 1, or something to that effect. So if that's the case, this Spot Channel Replacement is where I go to alias this. Now I'm going to kind of make these windows a little wider so you can see better here. Okay. At the very top, Spot Channel Replacement. This is talking about separations to color replacement, and we're not doing separated work, we're doing composite work. So at the bottom, look at this category, PDF to PostScript spot color to replace. This is where I want to alias it at the bottom level. So you'll notice document spot color name. What do we name it in Illustrator? And what is our ink called, Spot 1? So here in this first category where it says none, this is where I would name it the name that I'm giving it in my Illustrator program for my spot color that represents the white ink, that the graphics are on top and overprinting, okay? So maybe I call it white 1, or maybe I call it white ink. It's case and space sensitive, so however we call this, we give it that name, and then when I click OK, I now have that aliased in there. I'll go back in just to show you. I have this information aliased. So if it sees a spot color called white, it knows to use the Spot 1 channel. If it sees a spot color called Spot 1, it knows to use the white channel. That's our generic name. Okay. So again, if I look back in Illustrator and I double click this color, Spot 1 is what they named it. But if it was named as white, then I would get the aliasing taking place. Okay, so I just wanted to show you, that's where you go to alias that name. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there's only, I believe, there's only room for one color designation here. I'm pretty sure. In other words, I've got some customers that call it white. Some customers call it white ink. Some customers call it something, you know, along the words white something number 1 or something like that. I have to double check that with support team, but I believe there's only one indication here to give it that name, that one generic name. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and OK again, and then OK again. So now I'm going to test my file. I'm going to open up my white tiger. Got that in my training files down here, white tiger with white ink. And I'll open this up in Job Editor just so you can see. As soon as it comes in with the preview, we'll start to see there's the green color from my media profile. My media profile was white ink with clear media, okay, whatever we named it. I named it that. And there's my indicator, and there's my 75% opacity as well. So if I look at this, I can see that's my representation of my spot color for white. Over on the left, we can kind of see the makeup. Here's the profile I'm using, and it's got CMYK light inks, orange, red, NW white. One spot is in this file. If I picked a profile that did not contain my white ink then I'm not going to get that representation for that spot color to come across as representing for white ink. It would not come across as such. Also, if I go to color correction, you can see your ink set, and there's my spot color right there. So just to show you a little bit about what's going on within this area, within these fields. You know, we've got our spot color or white. If we named it white, it would say white here. We have that representation there. Okay, now let's take a look at working with a file that was not prepared with a specialty ink setup in it, a spot channel ink setup in it. One example I always would lean to would be in our training files in our samples folder of the ONYX RIP. We've got a samples folder and there's the ONYX quality evaluation. So these files are not prepared with any type of specialty ink in them whatsoever. So actually, I'll go through like we have in the example for the video. I'll do the wheels and I'll open this up. We've got a video on Spot Layer Tool, and it uses this particular image. And it's a nice one because of the background. So I'm going to go ahead and use that as an example as well. I'll open up my Wheels ink limit into Job Editor. Again, on the left, you can see I'm using my profile with the white ink. When I go into my color correction tab, I can see I've got a spot color record in my profile. However, I'm not seeing the green display of that color of white ink. This file has not been designed with a white ink indicator in it. So what I would do is under Tools, I would go to Spot Layer Tool. I would enable my Spot Layer Tool. I could select the color. I've only got spot 1 or white. And now I can apply the type of attributes. If I said flood fill, I get the flood fill display. And there's my 75% opacity for display purposes. It's still going to print at that amount. I put 80%, 90, 100 for my white ink, but this is the display generated at 75% opacity for display, and display is green. I also could say just fill the image area. Wherever there is a pixel, put white behind that. And that can give a nice effect. If I'm printing on a clear material, I might want white to be behind my image content, my ink setup, but then wherever else there is no ink going down, just be the clear material itself. Okay, and I often think of, for something like this example, I often think of in packaging, we've got some white behind the artwork, but yet there's some clear areas to see the product inside the packaging. All right, or I've got my third category is fill non-image area. So in other words, anywhere there isn't ink going to print, pixel data going down, that's the opposite. So if I set this up for flood fill, I now am going to have this contribute to being a flood fill for white when I have files that were not prepared for my specialty ink white, for example. So one more little thing to mention here is I could save this out as a quick set and have this quick set be used for files where the artwork has not been prepared to do a flood fill or any of these indicators, you know, image area, non-image area. So I can have this created as a quick set and use this. So I'm going to go through those steps right now. I'm going to go to Filter. I'm going to go to Manager. And I'm going to export this out. Do I want to apply my changes? Yes. And I'm going to call this as my flood fill for white, flood fill white filter. I'm going to save this out in my folder. Actually, I'm going to go to my RIP information samples folder, and I'm just going to save it. Here I can make a new folder because samples folder is a little bit, I'm just going to call it filters. sample folders is just a folder of training images, so it's a safe place for me to put my data. Okay, I close this out, click OK, submit my job. Now, when that's done ripping, all right, I'm going to go to Configure Printer, and I'm going to make a new quick set, and this can be called Flood Fill with my white ink. So Flood Fill White. I'll go to my Advanced button and my color correction, and I'm going to import that exported filter. So I save this in my Samples folder, Filters folder, and there's my data. So I'll bring that in. Notice no filter selected. I'm going to click on that and select it. It will be applied, and I'll click OK. OK. So now, if I open my file again, and I choose my ink wheels ink limit, and I pick that particular quick set, when I bring that in, that should be applying that color filter as a flood fill, and you can see the green opacity. So for files that were not prepared with the specialty ink in them, designed in them, which again, that's what my documentation talks about, setting that up and designing it, whether you're designing that in Photoshop or whether you're designing that in Illustrator as a spot color. If my files are not designed as such, I can still use the spot layer tool and add that to the information and get that effect, and I could even create that as a color filter and apply that in my setup. So just depending on how we're working with that, we can cover a couple of different bases. And even if I bring in my ONYX quality evaluation, run that flood fill filter on there, bring that in, and then this file is going to have the flood fill for white. And again, this is a flood fill. However, I could have said image area only or non-image area only and submit that back. Okay. So that's just a little bit of working with the specialty inks, specialty colors, preparing some information. I'm going to go back to the other document I have. I'm going to send this out to you guys as well. It's a profiling specialty ink quick start guide. And this also talks about your initial ink configuration to use. So W for white, MS for metallic silver, V for varnish, or you might see S for spot. And in some cases, again, depending on the printer driver, in some cases, your printer drivers might have 2 white channels in them. They're going to print 2 at one time. So you might see S spot spot or something to that effect. And this is just talking about that configuration and then also getting into that configure spot colors and having the name. Spot 1 is our default, changing the color, changing that opacity, making that be 75% or 60%, something less than 100 so we can see through the information. We can see through that the data of the spot color specialty ink compared to our image that's going to print. And then also printing our swatch, we're going to print that specialty ink chart using that particular color that's there, that spot information, and then evaluating it. So this document just is a little bit about what we talked about in creating the profile. Remember, the next couple of steps we would be going through when we create that profile, we would keep telling the information to flood fill for white, and so forth. So that's one thing to kind of consider. Okay, so that's pretty much everything I want to show you today with our specialty inks, file preparation, rip controls, and profile settings. So I'd kind of like to open up the chat field here if you guys have any questions going forward before we wrap this up. If there's any questions out there. One person had asked if we, for the profiling part, you don't need to use a spectrophotometer device. Well, you do, maybe not so much measuring the white. When you're setting that up with your flood fills and you're doing your charts, it's a visual. So yes, when you're looking at the particular chart, that's your specialty chart, the specialty ink chart, the restriction chart. You're not necessarily measuring this, you're just visually evaluating what type of opacity, amount of ink, the volume of that specialty ink do you want. Okay, another good question. Do you need to create a new profile or that's using the white ink, or will you be able to download one that's already configured by the manufacturer? That's a good point too. The printer drivers, that when you download your printer drivers and you install them, or if a client is already installed, the media profiles that come along with that particular printer driver may be configuring or including specialty ink. With this particular one, I only downloaded a few of the categories. This choice here, Magic Solvent Clear Film, this was already provided with the driver, and this one does have the specialty ink set up in it. So just depending on what you're working with, if the manufacturer has created a one with the driver or not, you can use the one that's there and take, just use that and see what results you get, or you can always go through and create your own media profile as well. In some cases, you might not have one at all, and you have to create one. So let's see. Okay, if you have two white channels, right, WW, and you set up the spot 1 for white, will it use both spot channels in one? So when you're working, or do you need to set up a spot 2 for the second channel? Okay, that's good. When you're working with something that's got two spots in it, WW or SS for spot, when you're working with something like that, because you could only print back in the Media Manager, let me go back in here and edit. When we get to the specialty chart, because we could only print one at a time, like I would literally see spot 1, and then in the pull down, I'd see spot 2, or WW or SS, I'd see something like that. You can only print one at a time. So because if the printer is going to print both those white channels at one time, you might print one specialty chart, evaluate it, and if you said like, gee, 80 looks really good, then you can say, well, okay, 80 is going to look good, and you're going to have two of those white indicators printing simultaneously. Print your chart, your next chart, which is your regular ink restriction, with both of those at 80, and evaluate that white amount. Because at that time you're printing live the chart, it's going to print both of them. So when you go to this part to print, this is where you're going to be printing both at the same time, both whites. So evaluate and see what this looks like. And if you feel like, gee, 80 with two whites is too much, you could always go back and edit this to say 70 and print again. So they're both at 70. It's impossible for us in our software to tell it print both at the same time. We're doing one at a time to evaluate it. So one white by itself would have a double impact when you're printing two. So maybe you'd take a little bit of a lesser consideration for that amount too. All right, so let's see. Another question came up. So yes, you can still, one question came up that used to be advised not to change spot 1 to white, but you can't, that's not the case anymore. You really can call your, let me go back, here we go. You can change this to being white, or you can leave it as spot 1. And then, like I said, if you name this back here as white, then you want to alias this in the quick set. So back in the quick set, let me hop back in here real quick. Okay, change profiles, output tab, spot channel replacement. So this is where you would name it white. And that should work. Spot 1 or white, either way should work for you. There shouldn't be any issues. In either fashion, it should pick up the data. The big key here is be aware of that name of that spot color. I've had some people set something up and they were very determined that, you know, this was named white. I'm so sure of it. This was named white. And then it's not swapping out the color. And then we look at the file, it's actually, you know, white ink or something. It's not just white, it's white ink, or it's got a different name to it. So keep this in mind. It really is dependent upon the spot color name that's going to represent that specialty ink. But that should still be working for you. Okay, another question. Is there a metallic overprint guide or spot color conversion table? That one I'm going to have to get back to you on, because there was, way back when, there were some different recipes for creating or representing those colors if you didn't have the specialty inks. That one I'm going to have to check into with the guys at the lab and at the office. All right, another question, can profiles be copied for separate users, or does each user have to set up their own profile? How do you copy profiles to different users? Well, the profiles are going to be part of, let me just cancel out of here. The media profiles are part of that printer model. So if I go over to a different printer, I'll see, in this case, whatever profiles are made in this example. I'll see this information here. So the profiles are designated to the printer model. If you're thinking about the quick sets, well, the quick sets are going to be specific to the printer as well. So I'm not too sure what quite you're asking there, because it's not so much user specific, but printer specific. Okay, let's see, another question. Okay. When creating the profile and setting ink limits, you will be setting ink limits for all of the ink CMYK, including white, not just your specialty ink, correct? So when you're doing your ink limit, that's a good question. Let me come back into this one that I made as an example, because I can play around with that. All right, so let me go over here. So first, we're printing our specialty ink chart, okay? We're determining how much of that volume of that special ink I want, 100, 90, 80, and so on. When I come down to the next step to print my ink restrictions, I set that volume amount in there. Now I'm at 80% white, and I'm doing a flood fill under my chart. So now, calibration ink limits. So your question is, when creating the profile and setting ink limits, will you be setting ink limits for all ink CMYK, including white? My white has already been determined at 80 at this point. So when I print this ink limit chart, I tell it to flood fill right here, flood fill for spot 1 at the 80% that I previously determined up here in my ink restrictions. I typed in 80% and I said check on flood fill. So this has just been determined. My white's going to be at 80, and now my ink limit ABCs are going to print on top of that 80% white. So it's already flooding with that amount of white ink, and now I'm just determining my regular ink limit ABC amounts. Okay, let's see, another question. Can you create groups of color in a quick set, or the quick set only allows a single color? Well, okay, that's a pretty good question too. We can control a media profile selection in our quick set. So if I make a quick set specific to point to a certain profile, I can control that. So if I go into configure printer, I could say new, and I can turn off get media and page size from printer, and I could pick a specific media profile. Now, however this media profile is configured with its color information, right, my information that's here, I give that a name, whatever I want to call that, So I can make a quick set to not just use what's loaded, but to identify a specific media. So in a sense, create a group of colors in a quick set. Unless you're referring to my spot color replacements here, my color filter, I could do that as well. I could have several different replacement color pairs going on here in a certain quick set for sure. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question 100% right. Can you create groups of colors in a quick set, or the quick set allow only a single color? Well, the single color would be if I had a profile that was somehow just a separated one color data or something to that effect, or if I had a color filter in advanced color correction, I add that in here. What about CMYK colors? Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly what you're saying about CMYK colors, because if it's a color replacement, we can add those here as filters, and they'll be live and they'll take place in the swap out. Otherwise, if it's a certain profile that we want to indicate, we can select that here or save color correction to that group. Sure, color correction would be within the quick set. So I could import a whole bunch of different color correction filters I've made. I made that one earlier in samples folder for a flood fill, okay? But I could have several different color correction pairs here and have them all added in this group. And then that should take place for your filter swap out of colors, or save them all as one color filter. So in Job Editor, I can do color replacements and do several color replacement pairs, export that as a filter, and import that in my quick set and have that as one global quick set for all those different color replacements. So that can take place for sure. Okay. All right, thank you everybody. I think that might be all the questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing out my desktop now. And thank you all for attending, and I'll be emailing you all some information, the documentation that we've been working with, as well as some links to our videos. They're in our ONYX website. My ONYX website is going to be onyxgfx.georgefrankxray.com. And then once you log into your My ONYX account, you're able to take a look at the videos there. And we also have a YouTube channel, which is ONYX TV, and that's in YouTube. And you can also look at some videos there. But I'll send you some links and some emails. And thank you all for participating.